Hello, welcome to the Free Will Science and Religion podcast. I'm Chandler Klebs and I'm here with George Ortega and Mitch J. And we're going to talk about mistakes and how the very fact that we make mistakes is one more demonstration that we don't have a free will. So, because if we had a choice in the matter, wouldn't we always do perfectly as we intended and never make mistakes?
Well, Mitch, why don't you start with this? You kind of like brought it up last time, right?
Yep. Yeah. Okay. I'm a chess player. Chandler, you play chess as well, right?
That's right.
So let's create a scenario here. Let's say you were playing a game, a competitive game, and you wanted to win, and you were playing fairly, so and sportsmanlike, okay?
Yes.
And your opponent could handle losing, you could handle losing, you both could handle winning. You're just good, fair, balanced players. So you have no other concerns except to win the game.
Right.
There is no moral dilemma with you attempting to win the game. It's okay. Why don't you always make the ideal move? Why don't you take your time, think about all the possible avenues that you could take, find the best line, and win the game, particularly against weaker players. So you're playing a player who's much weaker, you're much stronger, you have the capability to win, you have the experience, you can win, and yet we don't. Yet we make several mistakes, and we often don't do what we want to do. We want to do the best play, but we don't do it.
Well, I have two responses for why that happens. For one thing, if people are playing a timed chess match, like, which, sometimes people are, then they start feeling in a rush and then they don't consider all the pieces on the board and then just completely omit such information, which leads to mistake.
Yeah, assume time is not a factor.
All right, but if we assume that time is not a factor, I can tell you the number one thing that has caused me to make mistakes while playing chess with people. And that is because I see where their pieces are on the board and I believe that I know where they're headed. I believe that I know which pieces they intend to move next. And sometimes I'm right. But on those situations where I'm wrong and them moving those pieces was just distract me from something even bigger they're planning, then they've got me fooled. And so then I make moves that are basically meant to foil my opponent's plan, which doesn't exist.
Yeah, okay. Well, I, I can relate to what you're saying, but uh, just to get on a little bit back on track here, not to be too specific about the actual mechanics of the game and
Yeah,
everything.
I think what we're saying like we need to simplify it. I mean, first of all, not everyone's a chess player, but
Certainly true. So the issue is, if you have a free will, you should be able to control yourself to make yourself do the best course of action. But we don't do the best course of action because we just do what we do. And if we over time, if you have the brain of a great chess player, you might be less inclined to make mistakes. If you've studied and your brain, you have memories of chess, you have skill that you've developed over time, you're more likely to do the best move and investigate the best moves and the best courses of action. But that's it. That's it. That's all we could say. No more than that. So I'd like to know how a free will advocate would defend free will in lieu of that scenario right there, that information. I don't see how.
and you know what, Mitch, it gets a little bit more complex than that because you know what? Both players are trying to win. So naturally, they're both trying to do their very best to win the game and make the best possible moves. So you know that often one that ends up deciding who loses the game is who makes the first mistake. Not always, but often that's enough right there. Just anything that's slightly not as good as it could be can cost them the game.
And I think there's various mistakes that we can actually identify. One, for example, relates to memory, memory of chess strategy, memory of, you know, like previous games that we've played and what we've learned from the mistakes of those games and all. So like, again, if we had a free will, our memory, I think, would be perfect. We could at will, because our will is not constrained by anything, just remember what we have to make the best move. A second kind of factor that I can think of is that, like, we have different intelligences, different kinds of intelligences. Some people are very good at the kind of like intelligence that's related to chess. Other people are, let's say their intelligence is more social. So there's various kinds of intelligence. But the thing with intelligence, as with so many of our attributes, all of our attributes actually, they're not up to us. We're either like born with them, or they're kind of cultivated as part of our environment, or our schooling, or just like life experience. So like, this, in other words, the proficiency of our logical moves is based on our intellect. And again, that's for the most part something that's out of our control genetically. And if it's not genetically out of control, it's environmentally out of control.
Exactly. So if one cannot choose the best course of action, so let's extend this analogy of chess to any decision that we're confronted with in real life. If one cannot choose the best course of action, then one cannot choose. That's it.
Yeah, it's
That's like,
and since your choices would have to be based on something in your biology or your environment or some combination of the two, then and you don't choose either of those, then it follows from that you don't choose anything.
And I mean, we're going to do another episode on morality, but this also extends to morality in the fact, I mean, like, we value being good, doing the right thing for ourselves and for other people, for the world. And yet, as Paul actually, like, relating this to the Bible, Paul's talking to the Romans, and he's saying, like, I don't know what's going on. I try to do the right thing, but sometimes I find that I can't. That's an expression he got, that we don't have a free will. Like, if we had a free will, we'd be not only perfectly error-free in our thinking, we'd also be perfectly moral.
Yeah.
absolutely.
And you
I
know
mean,
what's interesting?
yes.
Oh, yeah, I was just going
No,
to say
go ahead,
that,
please.
like in the chess example that Mitch brought up, that wasn't even a moral dilemma. It has no impact on climate
Exactly.
change. It has no impact on any major lasting social thing. It's just a game. But when it gets into moral decisions, the kind of decisions that affects who lives or dies, or who experiences pleasure and pain, well, those are much more important. And so we could understand. I mean, it's not a big deal if we make mistakes in a chess game, but we feel like we can't afford to make mistakes in the bigger issues.
I mean, let's take an extreme example, like a murderer, for example. Can't we frame a murderer's actions as a mistake? Can't we say this murderer had a choice? Okay, he could have killed or he could not have killed, but for some reason he killed. How can you differentiate that from a situation where I'm playing a game of chess and I could have taken route A, which was the optimal route, but instead I chose route B?
Yes,
Where is the distinction?
that's a great point, Mitch. It's basically, attempting to get the right answer, whether it's a right moral answer, a right logical answer, a right answer in terms of even self-interest. So you're absolutely right. It's just an error in decision making and in reaching the right answer.
Exactly. And here's the deal, Mitch. I'm glad you brought that thing up because you know what? When somebody does something that we consider immoral, like murder, I do consider it a mistake. The same as a mistake in chess. I don't attach there being an element of choice or an element of this person's evil has a sinful nature or any crazy thing like that I was taught growing up. It's
Right.
just that they made a mistake and that mistake has causes which can be investigated.
Yep.
All right, so let's now. I mean, we get this really strongly and clearly, but a lot of people don't. So let's kind of try to put ourselves in their position and try to figure out what a free will believer would say to our saying that, like, the fact that we make mistakes is a clear indication that our will is not free?
Huh. I don't know how to think like a free will
Yeah,
believer.
it's a little bit difficult for me as well.
It's
Uh, maybe in a future podcast, it would be good to have a dissenting opinion. Maybe we should invite someone who is a free will believer, so we can have those kinds of conversations.
We
Yeah.
absolutely should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know, and I've actually been trying to seek people out, who would be interested in being, a free will believer on this show, but I don't get replies. It's kind of interesting,
Yeah.
but I'm
But
sure we'll find somebody.
I'm sure. Well, I'm sure their line of reasoning would start with, "These are two different situations," and the argument would be trying to convince them that they are not different situations. This is the same thing. Making a
Exactly.
mistake when you play a game of chess is just another decision. It's the same thing as when you're confronted with a decision whether or not you should kill. They might argue that, when you make a mistake in chess, neuroscience hasn't figured it out yet, but it's really because of such and such factors. But when killers decide to kill, there's no correlation to that in the brain. It's a different situation.
Yeah, they act like it's a different thing when reality, the process of so-called decision making is the same whether it's a moral situation or just a game.
I think another approach they might try, because they tried, relative to a lot of our free will refutations, is that, well, we're not saying that our will is completely, say, free. We're only saying that we have a partially free will, so that our partially free will, can't prevent mistakes, but it can nonetheless allow us to choose, between two options. And no, naturally that doesn't make sense in a sense, because, like, if we have any kind of, like, decision making at all, why couldn't we decide to get the answer right as opposed to wrong?
Right.
That's a good point, George, because here's the deal. Let's say that you have a 1% free will, that 1% of your decision is independent of your genetics and conditioning. I don't know how that would work. It's insane, but just go with me on this. Because is that tiny amount enough to push you from option B to the best option A? Is it enough to do that? And if it is, then you basically can be a perfect angel, and then you have to explain why you're not.
Yeah. I Doesn't make much sense to me.
No, it really doesn't.
But yes, I think that would be the argument that one would have to have. So perhaps in the future we can have that. Is there a distinction between moral decision making and the kind of decision making you make for a game? Let's say that. So is that a special kind of situation where you could invoke free will suddenly? Is there any
Interesting.
is there any reason to believe there's any truth to that sort of idea?
Well, here's okay. Let's extend this example of chess further by saying the chess pieces are real people that live or die. If the piece is captured, then a person dies. Um, I mean, then you would be perhaps relating it into a moral situation, but it would still be a chess game. And then would that give you any more free will if the chess pieces were real people?
Yeah, that's really complicated. I don't know.
I
I
know that is.
All
I
right,
was yes.
another explanation. Basically, free will believers say that they can make a decision independent of anything that's outside of their control. So, like, let's say if we apply this to a reasoning based decision where, like, there's a right answer and the wrong one, even when we make the right answer, there's a reason. In other words, like, the right answer reflects an understanding that we have, which is the reason why we chose it. So, like, naturally, when we make a mistake, also there's another reason. The mistake might be a result of a flawed reasoning, or mistaken reasoning. The right answer is maybe an example of correct reasoning. But both, either the mistake and or getting it right, these reasonings are causes. So like basically once you introduce a cause into a human action, then you're faced with the question, well, does everything have a cause? And if everything does have a cause, the causal regression refutes free will. And if they happen to say, well, no, I made this mistake in my reasoning, but there was no cause to the mistake, whatever, then they've introduced causality, which again equally refutes free will.
Interesting.
Yeah, this is so interesting because basically, prior causes, since if there's a reason, like if you put ketchup on your sandwich instead of mustard, well, there's a cause for that. For whatever reason, you like ketchup more than mustard, and that's not within your control. And if something is uncaused, it happens for no reason, then the non-reason can't be in your control, and you can't make something acausally happen in your control. So,
Yes. If you can't control what caused you to make the error, then you have introduced something into your perception of reality. You are supporting those deterministic ideas. It's inescapable. I agree.
and this is interesting, guys, because it kind of gets rid of solipsism. Solipsism is the
Yes, I'm
philosophical,
familiar.
yeah,
Oh yes, for the listeners, yes, please, you should.
yeah, but solipsism is basically the idea that we create our reality and that nothing exists external to our minds. So, in other words, that would mean that Mitch and George don't exist, that they're just figments of my imagination, basically. And
Yeah,
that you guys, yeah, you
I
guys
think
don't.
some psychologists have theorized that children are very solipsistic. Like if you ever see a parent scolding a child, you'll see children behaving in a very selfish way, as if they haven't yet understood that other people exist. They can verify their own existence, but they haven't recognized yet, not truly. They have some instincts, some intuitions, but they have to grow to and learn to understand empathy. They have to develop empathy over time. You'll hear children saying something like, arguing with their siblings, he took that from me. I want that. Why are you taking that? It's a very sort of kind of selfishness. And it's been theorized in the past that that's due to some kind of infantile solipsism.
Yeah, and you know what, Mitch, that makes sense because when you're just an infant, for example, you would be aware of what you want. You would be aware, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I want my diaper changed or whatever. You would not necessarily be as aware that there's other people in the world who have needs. You wouldn't be concerned about them because I guess we all kind of start out selfish in that sense.
Yep, certainly. It takes time. Your brain has to develop to a point for you to recognize that other people exist or what a person is.
All
But
right,
you,
guys.
yeah,
Yeah, guys, I can understand, the solipsism in an infant and a very young child, based on their lack of experience. But, I think, you know, infants and children, their reasoning capacities aren't fully formed. So, like, I'm trying to like understand the development of solipsism, you know, that's not based on our like mistaken infant misperceptions. In other words, like my question is like, did this concept develop, or was it most promoted after the advent of quantum mechanics? So like, because some people like in with quantum mechanics, they believe, for example, if we're not detecting or measuring a particle, the particle doesn't exist. This is part of like the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. So like I'm just wondering whether that term, either was coined or just like, gained some kind of credibility among people as a result of this quantum phenomenon.
That's interesting because um, yeah, it's really bizarre because this solipsism is kind of a new idea. I mean, at least, of course, I don't really know. I mean, I don't know what went on before 1987 when I was born, but it does seem like it's sort of a weird view. Like I know some philosophers have believed in this idea that if you're not perceiving something, it doesn't exist. Um, but it seems kind of counterintuitive for me how someone could believe that.
Well, unfortunately, it's not the kind of thing that can be refuted. It's irrefutable. I mean, we no form of evidence, of physical evidence in this reality, can verify whether or not other things exist.
Right.
Yeah.
And people compare it to the Matrix. Like if
Yeah.
you were in a Matrix, like Neo in the Matrix movies, and how would you know it? How could you prove it unless somebody took you out of the Matrix and then you could see somehow somewhere else? It's weird.
Yeah,
Well,
certainly.
I mean, in mathematics, you have axioms, right? In other
Yep.
words, like basically these are accepted premises that you have to have in order to conduct math, right? So we couldn't we consider, for example, the the fact or whatever that existence exists, that something exists, whatever, whether we want to call it the universe or reality, couldn't we hold that to be a priori knowledge that it really is indisputable? That's like, so self-evident that it rises above just requiring proof.
You read my mind, and that's exactly what we do. That's what we do.
Yeah.
So so I have discussed this with others in the past. I reject solipsism because I cannot disprove it. It's not. It's a fantastic idea. It's great for trying to find new insights about important issues. It's always good to think about provocative, interesting ideas. But yes, I think we need to operate under the assumption that things exist and other people exist, even
Right.
though all we can do is verify our own existence.
And guys, this heavily relates to the free will topic, and maybe you're seeing this already, but basically, by acknowledging that things exist outside of you and that those things are outside of your control, then you've admitted you can't have a free will because you're admitting that your perception is dependent on other things that exist independently of you.
Indeed.
So
Okay.
yeah, it's almost like you have to be a solipsist in order to maintain the notion of free will.
Interesting.
All right, so let's go back to the idea of like, mistakes kind of like providing ample evidence that our will isn't free. What other kinds of mistakes in reasoning do we make? In other words, some of them are simply mistakes in critical analysis and logic. Um, Other mistakes, I think, revolve around our not considering all the relevant facts, perhaps forgetting some factors, like in chess and all. Are there other kinds of like aspects to getting things right that when we don't, they just reveal this like impossibility of free will?
Well, I think that our emotions, and what we feel like doing and what we need to believe in order to maintain a certain feeling of happiness, that causes us to make mistakes more than just about anything else when you think about it. You know, because people, it's very hard for them to let go of the feeling of being in control, and so we know that's one reason why they have a hard time giving up free will belief. But it's also people become concerned with the pain or pleasure that they're feeling, and therefore that becomes more important and trumps the pleasure and pain that other people are experiencing.
Okay, let me see if I can relate this a bit more closely to our point. So like somebody's trying to get an answer right, and you're saying that their emotions interfere. In other words, like they have an emotional need to have a certain answer. Like for a lot of people, their emotional need is to have free will. So it's such a powerful emotion that it overrides their logic and it leads to mistakes. Is that your point, Chandler?
Exactly. It's just like Nick Vale was saying about emotion trumping reason. And I think it's powerful. People make mistakes all the time. Like take for example, people who are in love or something like that. People who think they're in love and their hormones are are crazy, and so they do stupid things. And when they're a teenager, they're more emotional, have mood swings, and so people do stuff that later on in life they look and they think, well, I should have done this, but at the time, their emotions and the way they felt.
That's a great point. So, um, it's been said that a certain part of the brain that is involved res- with making rational decisions, being a more rational person, does not get developed in males until their late 20s. So when you're younger, but you're still an adult, when the government recognizes you as an adult, biologically there is evidence to show you are not a fully rational, reasonable person, whatever that means, by the standard compared to people who are older than you. So how can we blame someone for making a poor decision if there is evidence to show that person is more likely to be rash?
Yes.
Yes, we can't
Absolutely.
control our emotions, but we are emotional. I think most people would agree with that. I hope we don't have to argue about controlling. I mean, we can't control chemicals as they flood through our body. We can't control random surges of electricity over our neural network. We can't control our circulatory system. We can't control our emotions. So I think most people would give us the benefit of a doubt here on that train of thought. So if your actions are partially motivated by your emotions, isn't that enough? Isn't that enough to say that you have no control? Is it?
It really
Is
is.
Yeah, that is enough, I believe.
Right. But Mitch, I mean, like one thing I've heard some people say with that example with emotions, they'll say, "Well, I can control my emotions." For example, like let's say somebody's going into a job interview and they're really afraid. They're afraid of not getting it or not impressing them, but they're gonna like all of a sudden like make themselves really confident and just emotionally upbeat even though they're not feeling so like so what would be your response to that kind of like emotional regulation?
Yeah, so of course, this is where, so this is like the main issue that we're always talking about, right? We say, sometimes we talk about free will being an incoherent idea, but sometimes we talk about free will as an illusion. So this is the illusion aspect of free will. There are times when we have impulses, we feel a certain way, and then somehow we get an impulse that counters it, or we have a desire to not be that person at this moment. But so for example, you're really nervous and your breathing is not regular, it's irregular. So you think you're controlling your breathing at this moment. Usually one would just concede the point that I'm not controlling how I breathe. But in a stressful situation, all of a sudden a thought appears in your mind that says, "Hey, this is not good. You learned how to control your breathing from your sensei." That was a good time
Excellent.
to that was a good time to uh, to use that advice and to employ it. But of course, the counter argument is, where did the thought come from? You didn't control the thought that suddenly appeared out of nowhere that is telling you and forcing you and making you do what you were doing right now.
and
Right? Yes,
yes,
go ahead.
yeah, and let's not miss the larger point that there's a reason or a cause for why you are at this job interview and why you want to impress the person so that they'll hire you. And that desire is what motivates your every action.
Certainly.
Yeah, looks like we're a little over 30 minutes, but
Oh,
we've done great on this episode. Should we end this one then? And
sounds good.
Yeah, I think we've covered all the bases for this topic.
yeah, it's been great. Okay. You've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion, and we've had a lot of fun talking about chess, why we don't have a free will, and solipsism, and emotions. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and you'll hear us again in the future because we'll do more.